You know that meme where a woman asks her boyfriend how often he thinks about the Roman Empire, and the answer is frequently multiple times a day? My dual Novation Circuit live set is my Roman Empire. I've become kind of obsessed with building up this live set with my Novation Circuit rhythm and tracks linked together. And once I got an hour-long live set that I was able to perform live multiple times, I thought, why stop there? So I've been swapping songs out, adding new material, and overall just trying to get a really, really solid flow and reward friends of mine who come back to see me play with new stuff. So I want to dig into a couple of the new songs I've made on the setup because I freaking can't stop myself. Anyway, let's get into it. That builds. And builds a bit more, and I'll show you that in a second. I think this one's a pretty good template for how I've been constructing techno tracks on this setup lately. The nice boomy kick with an imperceptible amount of distortion. Rolling bass line. And I've done very little to this sample. It's just a pretty solid sample. But you can hear I've sidechained that to the kick. And I believe I have the slightest, once again, most imperceptible amount of reverb on it. This track isn't doing anything yet, so let me skip forward. So this is my percussion track. And for those of you familiar with the circuit rhythm, you'll know that you can switch between multiple sounds on one track. So that's what I'm doing. And I also have this sent a bit to the reverb and delay. That's it dry. So just multiple different sounds. Wait a bit. Play that again. And then that little acid stab. And the reverb and delay go a long way here, I feel, to making the sounding a lot more coherent. And I love the sound of that specific bass stab with that reverb and delay. And then, on top of that, so I've got that clap on there as well, just because I needed some extra percussion and didn't want to clutter this up, and didn't necessarily want to bring it in right away. And let me show you the difference that the reverb and delay make here. Solid sample. But boy, that sounds stilted. And that clap cuts off the tail of that little plunk thing. That's too much. But that's a lot more coherent. And you also will have noticed I have yet one more sound at the end of this. Wait for it. That like inhale thing. So 4 tracks so far for those of you keeping score at home. So at this point, my primary concern is that this sounds a bit empty. So let's bring in the circuit tracks. That fills it right out, I think. So I've got this patch, which is lovely. At this point, I have just thrown together an amalgamation of a bunch of different patches from a bunch of different sources, but the source of most of those sources is A Force Truly Evil, who I will never stop shouting out because he has a fantastic ear for getting the absolute best out of the circuit. And I believe this is one of his patches. And as is my usual setup here, I have drum 1 with a kick, so I can trigger the sidechain, but I have that turned all the way down, pretty much for every single project. That way, I have the sidechain pumping. And that's gonna sit here and do that for a bit. Hi-hat, very simple. Bride cymbal, also very simple. And this track is doing nothing right now. This is set to an intentionally blank sample, which you'll see why in a second. And then my trusty white noise whoosh, a downshift and a riser. Really ties the room together. And then finally, a clap. Shifted to hit just a single micro step early. so that it syncs up with the kick better. And we got this. So let's introduce another element. This bass. And this is going to become way more pertinent in a second. I didn't originally have this as part of this breakdown, but it's about to become very useful. One other thing to note, by the way. Watch the distortion on track 2. I have automated it to ramp way the hell up at the very end of its sequence. And then I have step automation on that first step to immediately bring it back to where it originally was. And that step automation is also present earlier on, just to keep the distortion locked to where I want it until I specifically want that distortion to rise over time. Step automation is something that for a long time I was pretty indifferent to, and now I find it completely indispensable for being able to get the absolute most out of a single project, because it allows me to evolve stuff and then snap stuff right back to where I want it at specific instances in specific patterns in specific scenes, which is nice. I can build this up, raise the filter cutoff, bring in some distortion on this bass. So we've hit a little peak of our build. And this track 7 finally comes into play. That's what the original sample sounds like. And so, cut some highs. Turn up the distortion to thicken it up. And the reverb and delay are also doing some work here. And I'm doubling that part up with this. Synth 1. Having these play in conjunction really helps them fill each other out, in my opinion. And in this case, for this second drop, I have selected empty patterns for my hi-hat and ride, so they're not playing. And then I can bring them back in with this. And I've put this off to the side here just so I don't get confused. Anytime I have scenes clustered together like this, it means I'm meant to be switching them simultaneously. But then this one, I don't want to change my tracks scene necessarily because nothing needs to change. I just want to change it on the rhythm. So I've put this off to the side here just so I remember these go together. This one I can just trigger once this little area is done playing. Helps me keep track of it. It might be slightly incomprehensible to anyone else, but that works. So the reason that I had this track set to a blank sound is that I want to return to the original pattern, but I want to make sure that I cut off this warble bass, or else it's just going to ring out. So instead, that just immediately gets cut off, and we're back to our previous little section. Then, to kind of wipe everything away, I can re-trigger this pattern, and I'm back to the kind of simplest form. I'm going to reduce the slope on this kick so it doesn't bleed into the next kick, and I can switch to whatever other project I want. And that's how we get into a bigger live set type setup. Here's a relatively similar project. Some key differences. Similar to last time, we have a different boomy kick. And then this element, which used to be a kick. So if I bring that down an octave and then get rid of all of the processing, check this out. You can hear its kick nature. Send it up an octave. Shorten it. Slap back delay it. Reverb it a bit. Make it back to the way it originally sounded. And then I've step automated my distortion. Wait for it. And then I can layer that with this little bass one shot. And then this silly little element. So this is basically what the sample sounds like. And I've automated that distortion. Yeah, add some slapback delay. Reverb. Wait for it. At the very end of the 8 bars, that distortion rises. And then I've sidechained this to the kick. So it's a pseudo rumble. That's our foundation. My classic ride cymbal setup with alternating low, higher velocities and a little bit of reverb. Of course, sidechain to the kick. Big sidechain fan over here at Gabe Miller Music. Hi-hat. Also sent to this slapback delay. Gives it this nice metallic quality. Not appropriate in every setting, but in this case I think it really works. And this bass used to sound like this. But adding distortion is kind of akin to adding compression. You're flattening that sound out. So there's that extra little bit, so it goes dun 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 instead of just wah. We can emphasize that with reverb. Then this white noise element is kind of fun. So I've step automated 2 things, my distortion and my start point. So for this one, I have my distortion up just a tiny bit, and I have my start all the way at the beginning of the sample. For this other step, I have my distortion turned up a bit, and I have my start kicked way forward, so we're kind of in the middle of the sample. And then I just cut this off immediately with a blank sample. There's the white noise. That's the blank sample that cuts it off, and then it doesn't sound awkward because I have this sent to the reverb. So there's a little bit of a reverb tail. And then for the next scene, I swap that out for a hi-hat. So far, we've been heavily focused on the circuit rhythm side of things. Let's finally get the circuit tracks back involved. So this is fun. Adjusting the filter frequency is really all you need here. And I elected not to automate it in this case because I wanted to be able to kind of tweak it on the fly. I've sidechained it once again. And then this track is initially turned all the way down. So this starts playing notes, but you don't get to hear them yet because I want to bring those in as I go. Just in the mixer. This big, slowed down pattern with this long, drawn out chord. Which sounds real nice. And then I have this pattern here, because at this point, I've been switching patterns slightly independently between the rhythm and the tracks. And so this one being tucked away down here is meant to be a very visual thing to immediately grab onto. So when I'm here, and I'm ready to switch to the breakdown, I can find this immediately. Wait for it. And mainly what this does is drop out a bunch of elements, including some of the percussion and both kicks on both devices. That way the sidechain is not being triggered anymore and I don't have to worry about it. And I can twiddle these parameters. That's kind of hype, and then we go into a second drop, essentially. And that's built up exactly the same way as all the previous stuff was, so I'm not going to go into that right now. A couple of similar projects. So this is a filtered down bass stab. I think it sounds a lot better filtered down. It's more percussive. But if I want to have a dramatic effect, well now, hey, I've got a parameter to play with, which is always nice to have. Similar ride. Lots of delay on this one. And reverb. That reverb and delay goes even farther on this track. Here's without. Just a basic little pluck. Filter it down. I've got the resonance turned up a bit. Bring in that delay. Bring in reverb. Boy, that sounds a lot more alive. I also have, as is tradition, a kind of drone element on the circuit tracks. Because that's the big thing with making stuff on the circuit rhythm. You can get really far, but sometimes stuff just sounds a little bit empty because I've made the minimum viable drop, but it's just not filled out enough. And bringing in the circuit tracks synth engines for that really comes in handy. So we keep dropping that stuff in. And then also, as is fairly typical, I have 2 effects tracks. Doing various one-shots. Hopefully that's easy to see. And both of those are sent to the reverb and delay at least a little bit. And finally, I've showed the making of the first version, the kind of 1.0 version of this track in a different video. But the main thing I want to show you here is the fact that I was able to cram a vocal into this. I've been having a lot of fun just kind of yoinking vocals from other places and using them in my own set and doing flips of vocals. So in this case, I ripped the vocal from a Droplex and Steve C song, and that song is a cover of a different song, so we're like a few layers deep here. So it's pretty simple. I just have the full sample play out. And I have some nice chords on the circuit tracks. And that little doo-doo-doo-doo. Sent that to the reverb and delay a bit. You can hear that tail ring out. And I've also got this set up for sample chopping. So this right here. That one right here plays out the entire sample. And then these are semi-random that I just started setting my start and end points and then seeing what sounded cool, which is how I got this. And then I've intentionally... Okay, stop that. Set very clear points that function as a turnaround. And then I've got the vocal reverb swell. That way, I can use this to lead into the vocal for the first time it's ever played. Then from there, I've just got another very strange configuration for my scenes just to keep me in the loop, pun intended, as to what's happening. Because I've been muting and unmuting tracks. I've been bringing in circuit track stuff kind of independently of the circuit rhythm. And then this tells me this is where you go once you want to start the breakdown. Unmute this stuff. And then this is your drop. And finally, one other thing I want to mention, you will have noticed I've been skipping around a bunch because all of these projects are very much deliberately intertwined with projects that I previously made for the kind of 1.0 version of my setup. So what I had to do is a little bit ridiculous. I basically did a grid of all the samples that are used so that I could find empty sample slots and then swap them out for new samples. And I've done this thing a couple of times because I kept running out of available sample slots to add new material. And so I just kept doing this little exercise where I would methodically go through each project, tick off the samples that were being used, and then find the blank spots. That's what these dots are, is these dots represent me having filled a previously overwritable sample slot. I would load in a bunch of new sounds as I found the space to do so, and then I would come up with a bunch of new material and then integrate it tightly with the previous tracks that I wanted to keep. So the 1.0 version of the set turned into kind of a 1.5 version of the set where there's a bunch of new material kind of interspersed. And at some point, we could even theoretically get to the place where we've got a full 2.0 version of the set where there's no shared material between the original and the new one. I kind of doubt it because there are some tracks that tend to go off when I drop them. That's why I've kept them around, and I want to make sure I have over an hour of material. It's always easier for me to cut stuff out or choose not to play stuff. I'd rather have some excess in case, oh, the next DJ is not ready yet, I can just keep playing. That kind of thing. If you'd like to see a full playthrough of a bunch of this new material, you can check this out up over here. And if you'd like to see the ins and outs of how I am connecting my circuit rhythm and tracks, check out this video down over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.